I have seen people shaking heaven and earth to use exactly the same yarn that I used for my projects, but is it really necessary to use exactly the same yarn indicated in the amigurumi pattern? Hey guys, I am Bianca from Crocheniacs, and in today's video I'll teach you how to substitute the yarn indicated in the amigurumi pattern correctly, and you'll still have like a perfect amigurumi in the end. There are plenty of reasons why you have to substitute the yarn recommended in the pattern. Perhaps the yarn is now discontinued and you cannot purchase it anymore. Or perhaps the yarn is not available in the country that you're living, or the delivery costs are going to be too pricey for your pockets. Or it might be that the shade that you want is no longer available, or it's out of stock. So yeah, you can see that there are many different reasons why we have to substitute the yarn that is recommended in the pattern. And now I'll teach you how to do it correctly. So tip number 1, observe the composition of the yarn. So if the pattern indicates that the yarn used is 100% cotton yarn, for example, so you should prioritize to substitute for another 100% cotton yarn. But before we continue with the video, something that just popped out for me right now. I'm teaching you how to substitute the yarn in a way that you still have your amigurumi as close as possible to the pattern that you purchased. You can always change it. And I have an example here. I have my Mrs. Claus that I worked with a 100% cotton yarn, and this is also Mrs. Claus. Like, ignore all the pins that are here because I still haven't finished. And this is 100% polyester fiber. So you see that the pattern works for both, but I wanted this effect. I wanted a bigger toy, I wanted to change. So the tips that I'm giving you here, teaching you how to substitute the yarn correctly, is in case you want to do exactly like this one, you want another Mrs. Claus for you, and you don't have the same yarn that I used. In this case, just to illustrate what I'm saying, I used Hobby Friends, it's 100% cotton yarn, and this is the one that I used here. But let's suppose you don't have the Hobby yarn, but you have other 100% cotton yarn in your country, in your city. So this is what I'm talking about. I'm teaching you how to substitute in a way that you have your amigurumi as close as possible to the size, the shape of the pattern that you purchased. Now back to talking about the yarn composition, because this is my tip number 1. There's a video here in the channel where I compare some brands that I like to use for amigurumis, and they are all 100% cotton yarn in this video because this is the fabric that I like the most. And although they have their differences, and I talk about all the differences that these yarns have between them in this video, people usually don't even recognize when I'm using one yarn or the other because they have the same composition. As I said, they are all 100% cotton yarn. I usually use the same crochet hook. It varies just a little, like 2 or 2.2 millimeter crochet hook size. I don't change that much from one brand to the other. The texture of these materials are very similar. So these are some facts that we have to pay attention when we are trying to substitute. This is actually really interesting because I feel like my eyes are trained to find cotton yarn, similar to the ones that I like. It's very funny. I went to Portugal a couple of weeks ago to visit a friend, and of course I went to a yarn store. Every time I travel, I want to go to a different yarn store to see what they have there, if they have different brands and things like that. And I saw one brand from Portugal called Rosário for Lisboa, which is Lisbon in Portuguese. And I even took a picture of the yarn composition just to show you. You can see that the yarn composition is also 100% cotton yarn, and this one is mercerized. You can see how much it shines, and the crochet hook recommended is the same as the ones that I use in the other yarns that I have here with me. So I don't know, let's suppose that I move to Portugal. Maybe this is a yarn brand that I will change and no one will even recognize that I changed the yarn for my amigurumis. So you can see that it's always possible to change as long as you pay attention first to the yarn composition. Tip number 2, make a sample. Okay, did you see a new yarn at the store? Is it very similar to the ones that you are already familiar with, but you have never used that before? Make a sample. And I have an example here to show you. I made some samples, okay, just to explain this idea for you. This ball here I made using Amigurumi from Círculo. And these two here, I used the Friends cotton yarn from Hobby. I even used the same colors because I wanted these samples to be as close as possible. So you see that for both, I used almost the same crochet hook size, okay? Because the crochet hook size recommended for this one is from 2mm to 4mm crochet hook size. But honestly, a 2mm crochet hook is just too small for this yarn, for the thickness of this yarn. So for this one, I used a 2.2. I cannot crochet with a 2mm or less than that. And this one here, this small one here, I crocheted with a 2mm crochet hook size. And let's compare the thickness of both threads. You can see that they are very, very similar. And just so you know, both the yarns are 100% cotton yarn. The Amigurumi is mercerized, while this one is not mercerized. But just so you know, this Friends cotton yarn from Hobby, they do have a selection of yarns that are mercerized, okay? And the thickness is the same. It just changes because one shines a little bit more than the other. So you see that the thickness is a bit different. Hobby is a little thinner than the Amigurumi from Círculo. And that's why for this one I used a 2mm, while this one I used a 2.2. Honestly, I can even crochet with a 1.8, but it's not that comfortable. It starts to hurt a little bit, so 2mm is comfortable enough. And I compare like the size of my crochet balls. You see that for both yarns I have very closed stitches. You see, here is the part where I decreased, and you can even see, you can't even see holes between stitches in both yarns and both decreases. And here the magic ring where I started. So of course this one would be smaller because the thread is thinner, and also I used smaller crochet hook size. But this is a good exercise for you to make the samples and put some labels. I mean, I know which one I used, which yarn here, because I'm very familiar with this kind of yarn, so I can even differentiate with the touch. But if you're not that familiar, you can make some labels so you know that this one is a sample for this yarn and this one is a sample for this yarn. And I even advise you to make a short diary of it. Observe the tension and compare these samples, the new yarn that you just purchased and the one that you are already familiar with. Observe the tension between these two. Did you use the same crochet hooks? Write it in your crochet diary. Are there holes between stitches? Were the decreases more difficult to make? And how does the yarn fit in your hands? Does it hurt? Does it hurt your fingers or your wrists, for example? And how much you paid for it? Was it worth it? These are just a few important questions that you must ask yourself when changing the yarn, and that's why I told you to make a small diary of the yarn that you're changing. So next time that you find a new yarn, you write that too, and you have like something to compare. You can see, okay, this one I paid $2 or €2, depending on where you live. But this one I paid €3. Okay, but this one is bigger than this one. This one hurts my fingers, this one doesn't hurt. Because we forget these details. We have so many things to worry about in our daily routine that we forget about these details. So write all the information that you gather through that sample. You can make, I don't know, just a small ball like this, just to have an idea. This one you crochet like 20 minutes or less than that. I am not a fast crocheter. Sometimes people ask me because, well, I'm an experienced crocheter, so usually people think that I crochet fast, but I don't, because I pay lots of attention in every stitch that I crochet. This is something very, very particular of me. I am not as fast as I wanted to, and that's totally okay, because every time I look at my amigurumis, I'm proud of it. So yeah, I don't even know why I mentioned it. So I recommend that when you make samples, always do the same crochet project for this sample, like this small ball here. So every time I buy a new yarn and I want to test it, I will write in my diary answering all the questions that I already told you before, and I'll save it. I'll save this small ball here, so I know that I can compare with other balls of yarns that I have. You can even put some labels in it so you don't get lost. When I lived in Brazil, the yarn that I used the most was yarn brand called Amigurumi. The brand is Circulo, the yarn is Amigurumi. And when I moved to Finland, I had to change also the yarn that I used, because it's not that easy to find. Amigurumi is available in other countries outside Brazil, but it's not that easy to find. So here for me, it's easier to use other brands. And these tips that I'm giving you in this video are exactly what I did to choose the yarn that I was going to work with. Now, I didn't want to change the style of my amigurumis. I still wanted them to have the same look, and they still have, although I changed all my yarn stash in the last 3 or 4 months of my life. Tip number 3, crochet hook. You changed the yarn, you kept the same composition, but the new yarn is a bit thicker than the one that you used to work with. Well, something that is very simple and easy to be done is to adjust the crochet hook with this new yarn that you purchased. So let's suppose the pattern indicates a 2.5 millimeter crochet hook size, but this new yarn is a bit thicker than the one that you used. You can always try to work with a 2 millimeter crochet hook size to make your amigurumi smaller and consequently closer to the pattern that you purchased. Tip number 4, weight. First things first, there are some different ways to measure the weight of the yarn depending on your country. Well, I'm from Brazil, as you all know, and yarn weights in Brazil are measured in something that we call tex, which is not short for texture. Tex, which I don't know what it stands for, and I did lots of research and I couldn't find what TEX means, but tex is a measure that indicates the thickness of the yarn based on the weight of the product. So the thinner the yarn, the smaller the tex, that is the thickness of the yarn. And all this information like weight, length, composition, and the crochet hook recommended, this is all written in the yarn label. And there are other nomenclatures for the US, UK, and even Australian terms to indicate yarn weight. And I am sure other countries have other ways to measure it too, because US, UK, Australian terms, these are the ones that I have already seen. I'm a bit more familiar with, and also the Brazilian, of course, because I'm from Brazil. But yeah, it would be impossible for me to know all different countries that exist in the world. And of course, internet made it easier for us because nowadays we can purchase patterns from different designers all around the world that use different nomenclatures and different yarn brands. So it's very important for us to know how to substitute yarn. And another thing that I believe is very important is for us as crocheters to have some autonomy in that decision on how to substitute the yarn. I'm a designer. I don't know all the abbreviations and all the terms that exist in the world. As I said, I know Portuguese, I know a bit of Spanish, so I know the Spanish terms, and I know a bit of UK and US terms, but there are other terms, there are other countries, and I don't know everything. But something that I consider to be very, very important is for us as crocheters to have some autonomy in that decision, how to substitute the yarn, how to change it, you know, analyze the terms, the US, UK terms, and I don't know which country you are, but have some autonomy in making that yarn substitution, because we don't know all the brands that exist. I mean, I'm in Finland now, And when I go to yarn stores here, I see brands that I have never seen before. There are some local brands that probably if I ask another designer about them, they will not know the brands. They won't have explanations to me. So I must have enough autonomy to look at this new finished yarn that I found on the store and see, okay, it is cotton or is it acrylic? What is the weight of the yarn? How can I check if this yarn is similar to Katona or is it similar to Hobby? Will my amigurumi work with this yarn? So for me, we as crocheters have to make this analysis when we see the yarn label. I have a few examples here to show you where can we find this yarn weight information. And this is Circulus website. I already told you about this brand that I like. It's a Brazilian brand, but they sell internationally. And you can see here that the yarn weight is measured in tacks, as I explained before. It's 492, the number. It is 100% mercerized cotton yarn, and you can check all other information like the weight, it's 125 grams, the recommended crochet hook, the amount of colors that they have, and you can check this here in the website. But since although this brand is Brazilian, as I said, they are selling internationally, they also put the yarn weight here in the US terms, like it's a sport yarn. And just to compare, this other yarn from the same brand, this is called Clea, and I usually use this yarn for embroidery in my amigurumis to embroider eyebrows, eyelashes, and things like that. You can see that this is also 100% mercerized cotton, but the tax is 151, while the amigurumi was like triple the weight. So you can have an idea that this yarn here is way thinner than the amigurumi. And that's why this one I use for embroidery, while this one I use to crochet my amigurumis. Now checking all the brands, famous brands, and I put Katona here from Shapius. This is a brand that lots of amigurumi lovers enjoy, and you can check again all the information here. And just so you know, these details, they are written in the yarn label. But if you don't have the yarn with you and you're at the store, you don't have to Google it. You can read all these details in the label. So you can check it's 100% cotton, the recommended crochet hook size, and the yarn weight here is fingering. But what is it? Fingering, sports, this one is called lace. There are lots of different terms, as I said, US, UK, Australian terms. You can simply Google yarn weight and you see different charts and explanations about what is a lace yarn, fingering, and sports yarn, DK, etc. And just the last example here is Honey Bunny from Hobby. This is 100% polyester. I like this yarn for plushy amigurumis. And here, as I said, polyester, you see that the yarn weight is super bulky. So it's always written here, the yarn weight. So if I want, for example, I'm working with this yarn and you want to substitute and you want your amigurumi to be as close as possible to mine, well, you will not substitute a sport yarn for, I don't know, a super bulky. It can look pretty, but it will look very, very different because it's a different yarn weight, it's a different composition, and the same works for this one. It is also 100% cotton, but this is lace yarn, while this one is a sport yarn. Okay, so before I show you my last tip, which is one of my favorites, remember to subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any new tutorial. Okay, so if you're still here with me by this point of the video, I want you to comment down below the name of your favorite amigurumi yarn. Okay, so let's move on to the last tip. Tip number 5. Make sure that the texture is similar. Well, I brought an extreme example here just to illustrate what I'm talking about when I mention texture, like a very similar texture. The first tip that I gave was to pay attention on the yarn composition. So these two yarns here that I have are both 100% polyester. I guess you can see how different they are. So this one is the yarn called Honey Bunny from Hobby. This is a very good yarn for plushie dolls. And yes, this is 100% polyester fiber. This other yarn here I bought in Japan. Well, there are lots of Japanese things written here that I have no idea how to read, but there is one word. It's called luminous. I have no idea what it means, but okay. This is also 100% polyester. You can see that it's very thin. And even the texture is completely different from this one, although they are both polyester and they're both 100% polyester. This one, I will never make a whole amigurumi with this type of yarn. I would just make some beautiful details in a doll dress, for example, because it's a very beautiful golden color. But I have already made some details in amigurumis with this. And although I said that I would never make a whole amigurumi with this yarn, it does have a very high definition of the stitches. You can really see all the stitches like single crochets, increases, and things like that with this type of yarn. I don't know if you have ever worked with plushie yarns before, but it's very difficult to differentiate the stitches with plushie yarns. You don't have like a high definition of the stitches with this sort of yarn here. And I am talking about two yarns with the same composition. So I showed you these two examples because although the composition is the same, in this case the weight is not the same, but it was just to illustrate. But sometimes you may have the same composition, the same weight of the yarn, but the texture is completely different. So my tip for you here is to first observe the pattern that you purchased, not the yarn. So when you look at the pictures, the photos of this pattern, does it have like a very clear definition of the stitches? Can you easily distinguish the stitches, like, oh, I can see that it's a single crochet, or I can see that it's a half double crochet, for example. So this way, when you observe the pattern that you purchased, you can look for similar yarns to have like the same definition in the stitches. Of course, this kind of things, when it comes to texture, things that we have to feel, it's way easier if you go to a local store. But I don't know, depending on where you live, it might be a bit more difficult. I know lots of people who only buy yarn online. If that's the case, I would love to hear from you. Please write down below the word online, because I want to know how many people here prefer to buy online than in local stores. But again, it's possible to observe those details in the website. So all the websites that you look online, they always explain all these details that are written in the yarn label. So look at the composition, look at the crochet hook recommended, look at the weight of the yarn, and by the pictures you can have an idea of the texture. I mean, let's suppose I see these two yarns being sold in an online store. I can easily see that this one is plushy and this one is not. So I know, again, this is an extreme example, but it is possible to see the texture by a photo too. I know it's easier in person, but it's possible. Okay guys, let me know here in the comments which tips you find most useful, and I'll leave you with this other video here because it's pretty helpful too.